They dug up a skeleton and with it a town's memory. It happened on a gray October morning, the kind where fog sat low on the lake and muffled everything it touched. A construction crew clearing land for a new lakeside resort hit something solid. At first, they thought it was another stump, one of many left behind when the pines were cut, but the dull crack of metal on bone stopped them cold. The backhoe operator killed the engine and silence rushed in. What they had unearthed wasn't wood. It was a human skull. The call went out. Within hours, the site swarmed with patrol cars and gawkers pressed against the police tape. Kids skipped school to watch, their faces pale with a thrill they'd later pretend never shook them. Old-timers stood back, shaking their heads, muttering about how the past never stays buried. For me, the story began with a phone call I didn't expect. I'd been out of the game for years, retired from the paper, the deadlines, the endless grind. My doctor called it burnout. I called it too much whiskey, too many funerals, too little sleep. But a voice on the other end, tight, urgent, said they'd dug up a body at Willow Lake, said it might be tied to a case I once wrote about back when it was fresh, back when the missing person posters still clung to telephone poles. That's how I found myself back in Riverbend, a town that liked to call itself quiet, though quiet often just means secrets well hidden. 15 years earlier, a local woman vanished. Her name was Claire Whitmore, 25 at the time. She was known for working summers at the Lakeside Carnival, the kind of event that drew families from all over the county. Bright smile, easy laugh, and a knack for vanishing into crowds. She had a younger brother, Sam, who'd looked up to her maybe too much. She also had a string of boyfriends, half of them forgettable, the other half questionable. The official story was simple. One night after the festival closed, Claire never made it home. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses who admitted to seeing her leave. Just gone. The kind of disappearance that gnawed at families and gave cops ulcers. The case went cold fast. A few leads, one pointing to a drifter, another to a jealous ex-boyfriend, fizzled out. The file ended up in the back of a cabinet, like so many others. Until now, the bones at the construction site matched the timeline. Female, mid-20s, dead at least a decade. The coroner's preliminary word was blunt force trauma, murder. Riverbend wrapped itself around Willow Lake, a place of postcard sunsets and mosquito-bitten summers. The town thrived on two things: tourists in July and the autumn festival in October. Everyone pitched in. Bake sales, hay rides, fireworks over the water. For years, Claire had been part of that rhythm, and her absence left a hollow beat no one wanted to admit was there. When the news broke about the skeleton, it cracked something open. The diner buzzed with theories. The library pulled out old clippings, and people who hadn't spoken Claire's name in years found it heavy on their tongues again. Secrets don't die here. They just go dormant. The man originally in charge of Claire's case was Detective Frank Harlan. He was already old then, and older now. Sick, too. Lungs ruined by decades of chain smoking. Body failing him faster than he admitted. I remembered him as stubborn, proud, the kind of cop who trusted his gut even when it steered him into brick walls. When I found him, he was sitting in his recliner, oxygen hissing low beside him. His eyes lit up when I mentioned the body. For him, it was unfinished business clawing back to the surface. I told them she didn't just run off, he rasped, as if vindication mattered more than breath. Harlan had suspects back then, but never enough to stick. A boyfriend named Rick Fallon, who'd left town under a cloud of rumor. A carnival worker with a record for assault. And a third name scribbled in the margins. Someone tied to local politics, a civic leader who was untouchable. That name never made it into the official reports. I left Harlan's house with a notebook full of contradictions, and a sense that time hadn't dulled his obsession. If anything, it sharpened it. My next stop was the library, a squat brick building that always smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The head librarian, Marjorie Keene, was a nervous woman with owl glasses and a habit of wringing her hands. She'd been around back when Claire disappeared, and she remembered more than most. Marjorie handed me a box of old newspapers, each one clipped, dated, cataloged, but her voice trembled when she spoke. She hinted at things she couldn't say aloud, glancing toward the stacks as though the walls themselves might be listening. People had wanted the case forgotten, she said. People with power. That was all she'd give me before retreating to her desk, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Still, it was enough to make me dig deeper. I spent nights hunched over old microfilm, coffee cooling by my elbow, eyes burning from hours of scrolling. Buried in the coverage were inconsistencies. Witnesses who gave statements later contradicted by neighbors. Property transfers, lots near the carnival grounds, sold quietly in the months after Claire vanished. And then, a note in the margin of one report, scrawled in Harlan's handwriting. Ask about the cabin. The cabin. It wasn't in the official file. No mention of it in the press. But locals knew. Every family here had some cabin or shack tucked into the woods. Claire's family had one too, on the far side of the lake, falling into disrepair even back then. Sam, her brother, had inherited it. If the bones weren't buried far from the carnival grounds, then why did Harlan's note point to the cabin? Sam Whitmore was a man shaped by grief. By the time I tracked him down, he was in his 40s, a mechanic with grease under his nails and bitterness under his skin. He never left Riverbend. Said someone had to stay to remember Claire. He spoke of her in fragments, her laugh, her fights with their father, the way she wanted more than this town could give her. But he also admitted they'd argued the night she vanished. Over what, he wouldn't say. His eyes clouded, his jaw locked. Grief is messy. It turned siblings into suspects and memories into weapons. But something in the way Sam avoided my questions told me he was hiding more than heartache. With the skeleton found, DNA testing would soon confirm if it was Claire. The lab worked slower than anyone liked, but the cops couldn't rush science. In the meantime, speculation filled the void. Was it Rick Fallon, the ex-boyfriend who stormed out of town? He had motive, a jealous streak, a temper, but no proof. Was it the carnival worker last seen drunk and angry? He died years earlier in a bar fight, taking his secrets with him. Or was it someone closer? Someone who knew Claire's routines, her hiding spots, her family's cabin. Someone the town trusted. The deeper I dug, the more the lines blurred. And the more I realized this wasn't just about one murder. It was about what the town wanted buried with her. By the end of that first week, I had a stack of notes and more questions than answers. The skeleton was only the beginning. What mattered was the web around it. The people, the lies, the things whispered in the library but never written down. And every thread pointed back to the cabin. The cabin was more than a note in Harlan's file. It was a shadow. I couldn't shake it, the way some words stick like grit in your teeth. Cabins out here were supposed to mean fishing trips, beer coolers, cheap escapes, not murder. I drove out to the far side of Willow Lake, down a road so narrow branches clawed the paint off my car. Sam Whitmore's cabin sagged against the trees like it was ashamed to still be standing. Shutters hung loose, the roof bowed. A padlock on the door tried to pretend the place mattered to someone. I didn't break in. Not yet. But standing there, I felt the weight of silence. No birds, no wind. Just the creak of an old place daring me to look closer. That night, I returned to Harlan. He was weaker than before, his voice rattling. I mentioned the cabin. He nodded slow, like he'd been waiting for me to bring it up. Couldn't prove it, he wheezed. No warrant, no grounds. Family property, private. Chief said leave it. Said we didn't want to stir trouble. Chief. Back then, the police chief was Martin Caldwell, now retired and living 2 towns over. A man who prided himself on community image more than justice. If Harlan was right, Caldwell had buried more than Claire's file. I asked why the cabin. Harlan's eyes narrowed. Neighbors saw her car head that way. Night she vanished. That was all he had. Thin, but not nothing. Marjorie Keene found me the next day. She came into the diner while I was choking down black coffee and eggs gone rubbery. She slid into the booth across from me, hands trembling so bad she nearly spilled the sugar jar. She said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. That night, 15 years ago, she was shelving books late. She saw Claire in the library with Rick Fallon, voices sharp. But she also saw someone else come in after they left. Councilman Gregory Lyle, the golden boy of Riverbend politics. Lyle chaired half the town committees back then, and his family owned big chunks of property around the lake. Marjorie swore she'd told the police, but her statement never showed up in the file. Harlan must have been overruled. She'd been scared ever since, afraid of crossing the wrong people. I asked her why tell me now. She said the skeleton made it real again, and she was tired of the whispers in her own head. Gregory Lyle still lived in Riverbend, though older, softer around the middle, with a smile polished by years of fundraisers. He played the role of civic saint, school donations, festival organizer, first name in the church directory. But the property records told another story. After Claire vanished, Lyle's company quietly acquired a parcel near the carnival grounds, and 2 years later, part of the land adjacent to the Whitmore cabin. No fanfare, no public record outside the courthouse ledgers, just names shifting hands. Why would a councilman want forgotten lakefront scraps? Why then I didn't have proof? Just a growing sense the town's pillars were built on rot. Before we move forward, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any twists. And if you love these dark, gripping stories, share them with your friends. Let's uncover the mysteries together. When I pressed Sam about the cabin, he snapped, said it was family business, said outsiders didn't understand. But grief makes liars out of us all. Later that night, I found him outside the auto shop, bottle in hand, staring at the gravel like it owed him answers. He said something that stuck. They think she just disappeared. They don't know what we lost that night. He wouldn't explain. He walked away, shoulders heavy, like a man carrying something far worse than guilt. The state lab confirmed it. The bones were Claire's. DNA matched. 15 years gone, and now she was reduced to charts, photos, and a box of evidence sealed in plastic. They also confirmed the blunt force trauma. The skull fracture was no accident. Someone struck her hard more than once. No murder weapon recovered. But soil analysis showed she hadn't been killed where she was buried. She'd been moved, which meant planning, which meant someone close enough to risk being caught. Back in the courthouse archives, I stumbled on something Harlan had circled but never followed. An unsigned letter mailed weeks after Claire vanished. It accused a man in office of silencing witnesses. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged. It had been dismissed as crank mail, but in the margin Harlan had written, Marjorie, the librarian. She swore she'd never written it, but her fear made me think otherwise. If she had seen more than she admitted, maybe the letter was her way of telling the truth without putting her name to it. Reconstructing that night was like stitching a torn map. Witnesses claimed Claire left with Rick Fallon. Others swore she stormed off alone. Sam said he hadn't seen her since their argument. But a bartender remembered seeing Gregory Lyle near the carnival grounds late, well after his usual appearances at the beer tent. If Claire Claire had gone toward the cabin. Who followed her? Fallon jealous and drunk? Lyle desperate to keep a secret? Or her own brother, angry from their fight? Every version ended at the same dead place. Claire gone. I almost missed it. A dusty box at the county records office, half-labeled, misfiled under property disputes. Inside were deeds, surveys, and one battered notebook. It wasn't official. More like a diary belonging to Claire. Her handwriting was rushed, angry. She wrote about fights with Rick, about feeling watched near the festival, and about a secret she planned to expose. Something involving land deals, money under the table, dirty hands and clean offices. The last entry, meeting him tonight at the cabin. Can't let them scare me anymore. She never wrote again. If Claire had threatened to expose Gregory Lyle, motive snapped into focus. But suspicion alone wasn't evidence. Lyle had connections, money, a spotless record in the eyes of the law. Rick Fallon looked like the easy scapegoat. Angry ex, history of fights, vanished conveniently after her death. But easy doesn't mean true. Sam lingered in the shadows too. If Claire confided in him, did he know more than he admitted? His bitterness wasn't just about grief. It was about betrayal, about silence. The pieces refused to settle. Word of the diary leaked before I could stop it. Small towns bleed information like open wounds. Suddenly, half the diners swore they remembered seeing Lyle near the cabin. Others claimed Rick confessed once after too many drinks. Still others painted Sam as unstable, jealous of his sister's plans to leave town. Riverbend split into camps, each theory sharpening old grudges. The past wasn't just back. It was roaring, and I was caught in the middle. Notebook filling with leads that all pointed in different directions. Out of nowhere, Rick Fallon returned. 15 years gone, and he walked into Riverbend like a ghost in worn boots. He claimed he'd heard about the discovery on the news. Claimed he wanted to clear his name. The sheriff's office brought him in. Questioned him for hours. No confession, no cracks. Just a tired man who said he loved her once and left because staying hurt too much. But the look in his eyes, haunted, restless, told me he wasn't done with the past. By then, every thread wound back to the same place. The cabin. The diary. The land. Claire had gone there that night, planning to confront someone. She never came out. Her body was buried miles away, moved like a pawn off the board. Who killed her? Fallon with rage? Lyle with power? Sam with secrets? The answers waited in the woods, in the rot of an old cabin that had held its silence too long. The town braced for answers it claimed to want, but secretly feared. And I braced myself for what I knew had to come next. The confrontation. The cabin didn't wait. It pulled me back like gravity, every lead circling tighter until the woods themselves felt complicit. By late November, the sheriff's office had enough scraps of evidence to request a warrant. Soil samples near the cabin matched trace elements found on Claire's clothing. Not proof of the murder itself, but proof she'd been there. That was the crack we needed. I went with them the day they pried the lock open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mold and rot. Dust filmed every surface except for one patch of floorboards near the hearth, swept clean, almost deliberate. Beneath them, investigators found what time hadn't erased. Fragments of fabric, dark stains, and a rusted hammer. Forensics would later confirm it. The hammer was the murder weapon. Claire's blood still clung to the grooves. It wasn't enough to name the killer, but it was enough to set the trap. Rick Fallon paced town like a marked man. People crossed streets to avoid him. He swore he'd been gone, had nothing to do with the cabin. Yet the hammer had his fingerprints, smudged but identifiable, etched into the handle. He claimed he'd used it years earlier while fixing shutters with Claire's brother. Sam Whitmore admitted as much. Said they'd worked on repairs together, but his face hardened when I mentioned the hammer's discovery. Like something unspoken clenched his jaw. Gregory Lyle denied everything. Denied being near the cabin. Denied ever speaking to Claire outside of festival pleasantries. Yet Claire's diary sat in evidence, pointing a finger straight at him. 3 men, 3 stories, 1 weapon. The truth came from the smallest oversight. The cabin's floorboards had been replaced after Claire vanished. The receipts, buried in the county records, showed who paid for the lumber. Not Rick. Not Sam. Gregory Lyle. He'd covered the scene, hidden the weapon, then sold off the land around it in bits and pieces to distance himself. Money had cleaned the trail, but paper never forgets. When confronted with the receipts, his polished smile faltered. We brought him back to the cabin. Not officially. This wasn't procedure, but sometimes the truth doesn't bend to paperwork. Harlan insisted on coming, dragging his failing lungs with him. He wanted to see it through. Lyle stood in that ruined cabin, staring at the hearth where the boards had been lifted. For the first time, he looked small. The sheriff laid out the evidence. The hammer, the stains, the diary, the receipts. Each piece dropped heavier than the last. Lyle didn't shout, didn't bargain. He just exhaled, long and tired. He said Claire had threatened to expose him. Land deals, kickbacks, bribes, things that would have destroyed him. He met her that night to keep her quiet. When she refused, he panicked. One swing, then another, and silence. He buried her far from the cabin, thinking distance would protect him. He was wrong. Lyle walked out in cuffs, calm as stone. Reporters snapping shots while neighbors whispered. The town's golden boy unmasked. At trial, the evidence stacked like bricks. Forensics tied the hammer to the fatal blows. Property records sealed the motive. Claire's diary filled in the intent. Lyle's own confession recorded that night was the nail in the coffin. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. apology. Life without parole. Closure, they called it. But Riverbend didn't feel closed. The festival went on that fall. Quieter. Strained. Families whispered about how close they'd lived to a killer. Kids who once waved banners for Councilman Lyle now spat at his name. Sam Whitmore drank harder, haunted by what he hadn't seen, what he hadn't stopped. Rick Fallon left town again, this time for good, bitter at being dragged back into suspicion. And Harlan, he didn't make it to the sentencing. Weeks later, his lungs gave out. At his funeral, people said he'd finally laid his case to rest. I wondered if he believed that when the end came. I walked the edge of Willow Lake one last time before leaving. The water was black, giving nothing back. 15 years. That's how long it took for truth to surface. And even then it came jagged, messy, full of scars. Justice doesn't heal the living. It just buries the dead properly. Claire Whitmore's name is carved on a headstone now instead of whispered in diners. The town remembers her again, not as a file number, but as a sister, a daughter, a woman who wanted more than Riverbend would allow. And me, I left with another notebook full of ghosts. Because cases don't end. They just stop taking your calls. If this kept you hooked, the next case on your screen will pull you even deeper into the shadows. Click the icon on your screen to continue your ride. The next story is waiting.